The morning wind whistled through the pines like a warning from above, a whisper to keep going. But Dalton Keene had come too far to turn back. Once a strong rancher, today he had only a rickety wagon, a faded colt, and the title to a dilapidated cabin in the wilds of northern Montana. He knew little about the cabin, just a hasty transaction with a saloon shill, a man trembling with debt and smelling of fear like rotten sweat. Buy without seeing, they said. Only fools do that. But when Dalton lost his father's ranch to a gang of ruthless lenders, he had nothing left to lose. So when he saw smoke rising from the chimney of the supposedly empty cabin, his heart sank. "No, damn it," Dalton whispered through gritted teeth. Someone was living in his house. Someone was lighting a fire with the wood he'd piled up before winter. Someone was taking the last hope from a man who'd lost everything. And Dalton Keene wasn't the kind of man to let anyone take anything, not even a pebble. The wind blew through the pines, whistling like a weapon about to be drawn. The wagon wheels crunched on the cold, wet gravel. It was barely 8 in the morning, but the air was thick with the smell of old gunpowder, burning turpentine, and uncertainty. He climbed out of the wagon, his hands shaking slightly with cold or anger. His steps were heavy as he walked toward the door of the cabin, one hand already on the butt of his gun. No knocking, no calling. This was his house, and he would enter as its rightful owner. The door opened with a groan that sounded like a complaint. The cabin wasn't as deserted as he'd expected. On the contrary, it was suspiciously clean. A vase of wild flowers was carefully placed on the wooden table. The scent of baking bread wafted into his nostrils, a luxury 3 days' journey from the nearest town. And then he saw her, standing by the fireplace, her hair red as burning embers, the light from the window casting a pale halo around her head. Her green eyes were bottomless pools in the woods. They looked straight at him, not afraid, not surprised, but prepared. "You're the new owner, aren't you?" Her voice was low, even, and as cold as well water in early winter. "I've been waiting for you. This work and do, in the said, even resetter." Dalton felt as if the world had stopped around him. His name hadn't even been asked, but she already knew. A strange feeling rose in his chest. Not love, not doubt, but the feeling that something was wrong. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat, his voice rough as a whetstone. "I'm Dalton Keene. I bought this house, and I have the papers to prove it." She nodded, unsurprised. "My name is Cora Lane. And before you ask me to leave, there's something you need to know." Dalton narrowed his eyes and stepped closer, his hand still on his weapon. "I can't leave." Not that he didn't want to, but that he couldn't. Her words were like cold knives piercing his unyielding skin. There was something in her voice, not like a thief, not like a con man, like someone seeking shelter from an approaching storm. And in that moment, Dalton Keene, a man who had lost everything, felt like he was entering a new battle. Not of guns and bullets, but of secrets, blood, and irreversible decisions. If this Western story excites you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to stay tuned for more exciting adventures. Dalton put his hat down on the table, trying to keep his voice calm despite the frustration rising inside him. "Miss Lane, I don't care what deal you made with the previous owner. I have the legal papers, and this is my property now." Cora backed away from the fireplace, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. "I understand your position, Mr. Keene, but there are things about this place that you don't know. Things that could change everything. The only thing that matters is that I paid for this shack with money I couldn't afford to lose," Dalton said, taking the certificate out of his coat pocket and placing it on the table between them. "However bad the sad story you are about to tell is, I have heard worse. I have lost more than that." A light flashed in Cora's eyes. Not fear, but pity. "I'm sure you've been through a lot, but this isn't about money or legal papers. This is about survival." Dalton stared at her face, searching for signs of deception. She was unlike the vagabonds and swindlers he had met in town. Her clothes were clean, Her hair was neatly braided, and the shack showed signs of careful care. NIS. Someone actually cared about this place, not just used it as a temporary shelter. Whose survival? He asked, his voice softening involuntarily. Before Cora could reply, a noise outside made them both freeze. With things approach. The sound of horse hooves was approaching quickly. Several horsemen passed by the sound. Cora's face paled and she quickly moved to the window, carefully hiding behind the curtains. "How many people knew you were coming today?" she whispered, her initial calmness completely gone. "No one. I keep this deal a secret." Dalton followed her to the window, and through the trees he could see 3 men on horseback coming up the trail. They ride with a purpose, unlike ordinary tourists. "Do you know those people?" Cora's hand shook as she gripped the window frame. "I hoped they would never find this place." The leader was a tall man with a black beard, carrying a much-used pistol. The other 2 followed him, like soldiers obeying orders. "They don't come here to visit." "Miss Lane," Dalton said softly. "What exactly are you running from?" She turned to face him, and for the first time since he had arrived, her defiance broke. "My husband, or rather the man who thinks he owns me." Dalton's stomach clenched. A married woman running away from her husband changed everything about this situation, but the horror in her eyes told him this was not a simple family dispute. He's not the type to take no for an answer. Cora continued, her voice almost inaudible. "And he has resources that most people don't have." The sound of horse hooves was getting closer. Dalton found himself instinctively moving to protect Cora and the door, though he couldn't explain why. 5 minutes ago he was ready to throw her out. "They're almost here," Cora whispered. But what neither of them realized was that the lead had been tracking Cora for weeks, and he had no intention of leaving empty-handed. The riders stopped before the shack, their horses snorting and stomping from the long journey. Dalton could hear the squeak of boot leather as the men dismounted, their spurs clicking on the steps. "Stay behind me," Dalton whispered to Cora, surprised by his own protective instincts. "I wanted you to go this morning, but now everything feels different." A loud knock shook the door. "Open the door! We know you're in there, Cora!" The voice belonged to a bearded man, and it carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Cora's breathing was rapid, and Dalton could feel her fear as a living thing in the small shack. End quote. "What do you want me to tell them?" Dalton asked softly. "Nothing," Cora whispered. "Don't let them know you saw me." But it was too late. The doorknob turned, and 3 men walked in uninvited. The leader's gaze swept across the shack and immediately found Cora standing behind Dalton. A cold smile spread across his calloused face. "There you are, baby. You gave us a chase." Dalton stepped forward, blocking the man's path to Cora. "This is private property." "You are trespassing." The bearded man's attention turned to Dalton, assessing him like a predator assessing a threat. "I'm Marcus Webb. The woman behind you is my wife, and she's coming home with me." "I am not your wife," Cora said, regaining her voice. "That marriage was forced, and you know it." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "The law says otherwise, and it is the law that matters here." Dalton felt the weight of the gun at his hip, but 3-to-1 was not a good ratio, especially when he didn't fully understand what he was fighting for. "That woman said she didn't want to go with you." "The woman," Marcus said, emphasizing the word mockingly, "has no choice. She belongs to me, like cattle or property." The cold cruelty in those words made Dalton clench his jaw. He had known men like Marcus before, people who believe that power gives them ownership over others. No one belongs to anyone else. One of Marcus's companions, a thin man with cold eyes, moved to Dalton's side. "Boss, let's just take her. This cowboy is outnumbered." But Marcus raised his hand, still staring at Dalton. "You seem like a reasonable man. Stay out of this, and no one gets hurt. This is a family matter, not yours." Dalton could feel Cora trembling behind him, but she didn't run or beg. Whatever happened between her and Marcus, she was determined to face it. "I bought this shack legally," Dalton said. "Miss Lane is my guest. That's my business." Marcus's face darkened. Your guest? How long have you known my wife? The question was so full of hidden meaning that Dalton's blood ran cold. Marcus isn't simply looking for a runaway wife. He's looking for a reason to justify whatever he plans to do to them both. Long enough to know she won't go anywhere she doesn't want to go, Dalton replied. Marcus nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already decided. I was hoping we could resolve this in a civilized manner. But it seems you have chosen to interfere in matters that do not concern you. The thin man's hand moved closer to the gun, but Marcus made a decision that would change everything for all of them. Marcus stepped back and signaled to his men, "Burn it." Those words hit Dalton like a physical punch. What? You heard it. Marcus's voice was calm, as if he had just ordered coffee. If my wife prefers this shack to her real home, then maybe she needs to see what happens to shelters for runaway wives. The skinny man immediately moved towards the fireplace, grabbed a burning log. Cora held her breath behind Dalton, and he felt something shatter in his chest. This wasn't just about property anymore. This is a story about basic humanity. End quote. You burned this shack down. You destroyed my livelihood, Dalton said, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun. I put everything I had into this place, Marcus shrugged. Mind your own business. The third man, silent until now, drew his weapon and pointed it at Dalton's chest. The boss wants you to back off. I advise you to listen. Dalton's mind was spinning. 3 armed men, himself, and a woman needed protection. But something in Cora's earlier words echoed in his memory. This isn't just about a bad marriage. This is about survival. Mr. Keene, Cora said softly, let me go with them. Don't lose everything because of me. But when Dalton glanced back at her, he saw something that completely changed his mind. Cora's hand went protectively to her belly, and suddenly, her loose dress made sense. She wasn't just running away from Marcus. She is protecting something much more precious. End quote. No, Dalton said firmly, turning back to face Marcus. She's staying. Marcus noticed Dalton's gaze and followed it to Cora. As understanding flashed across his face, his expression turned murderous. Do you think that child is yours, stranger? The accusation hung in the air like poison. Dalton realized Marcus was painting a picture to justify whatever he was planning to do to them both. The baby isn't his, Cora said. Her voice is stronger now. And it's not yours either, Marcus. You know that. Marcus's face turned red with anger. Everything about you belongs to me, including what is growing inside you. The cold cruelty in those words ended everything for Dalton. He has lost his farm, his savings, and most of his hope in the past few months. But he wouldn't lose his humanity by standing aside while a pregnant woman was dragged away by a monster. Dalton's hand tightened on the gun stock. She said she wasn't going. Period. The skinny man with the burning log laughed loudly. 3 guns against 1. You sure, cowboy? Marcus raised his hand again, looking at Dalton with renewed interest. Actually, I have a better idea. Since you want to play the hero so much, let's turn this into a game. But what Marcus proposes next will test everything Dalton thinks he knows about courage. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Here's what happens, cowboy. You and me, we're gonna settle this like men. 1 gun, 1 fair fight. You win, I'll go and never bother Cora again. Dalton felt his heart pounding in his chest. A fair fight with Marcus Webb might be a death sentence, but that's better odds than facing 3 men at once. And if you win? Dalton asked. When I win, Marcus corrected. Cora will come home with me, and you will be buried in the soft earth outside your shack. Cora stepped forward, her face pale but determined. No, I won't let you die because of me, Mr. Keene. You don't even know me. But Dalton was thinking about the way she had protected her belly, the horror in her eyes when Marcus had appeared, and the quiet dignity with which she had faced an impossible situation. You may not know her whole story, but you know enough. I know you're carrying a child who doesn't deserve to grow up with a father like him, Dalton said, not taking his eyes off Marcus. Marcus's jaw clenched. That child will learn discipline and respect, just like his mother should have learned. The way Marcus spoke of the unborn child, as a possession to be controlled rather than a being to be cherished, made Dalton's blood run cold. He saw what men like Marcus did to defenseless children. "You're afraid to face me alone," Dalton said, deliberately provoking Marcus. "That's why you brought mercenaries." Marcus's face darkened, and he signaled his men to back off. "Clean the porch. This won't take long." As the two men moved away, Cora grabbed Dalton's arm. "He's faster than he looks, and he's killed people before. I've seen him do it." Dalton placed his hand on hers, surprised at how right the gesture felt. "What's the real story, Cora? Why did you marry him?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she refused to let them fall. "My father owed Marcus money he couldn't pay. Marcus offered to forgive the debt in exchange for me. My father was dying, and I couldn't let him lose everything to medical bills. The pieces fit together. Cora was not just sold into marriage. She sacrificed herself to save her family. And now she's protecting her unborn child the only way she knows how." "Who's the father?" Dalton asked softly. "A good man died before he knew about the child. Marcus found out I was pregnant and decided the child would be his heir, whether the child wanted him to be the father or not." Dalton nodded, understanding everything now. "This is not about wealth or self-esteem. This is about a woman trying to protect her child from a monster that sees humans as objects." Marcus's voice rang out from outside. "Time's up, cowboy. Let's see what kind of man you are." But as Dalton walked toward the door, Cora whispered something that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. Cora's whisper made Dalton freeze. "Marcus isn't just my husband. He's your brother's killer." Dalton's blood ran cold. His brother Samuel was found shot to death on a remote trail 6 months ago. His horse and supplies were stolen. The sheriff declared it a random robbery, but the case was dropped without witnesses or clues. Number 3. "Samuel Keene is your brother." Cora's voice was almost inaudible. "I heard Marcus brag to his men about killing a rancher who refused to sell his water rights. He described the man's face, his horse, even the scar on his hand from a childhood accident." Dalton's vision blurred with anger. Samuel's death was the final blow, forcing him to sell everything and buy this remote shack. Marcus didn't just ruin Cora's life, he ruined the Dalton family. "Are you sure?" Dalton growled. He had his brother's watch. It had an engraving on it. He showed it to me when he wanted to prove what happened to those who opposed him. Dalton stepped outside, his hand steady on the gun despite the anger coursing through his veins. Marcus stood 20 paces away, confident and comfortable, as his two men stood on the porch waiting. "Before we do this," Dalton called out, "tell me about Samuel Keene." Marcus's confident expression wavered. "Never heard of him." "A rancher who refused to sell his water rights was shot on the Northern Trail 6 months ago." Marcus smiled. For real now. The mask of politeness has finally, completely fallen off. "Ah, that's Samuel Keene, the stubborn fool who thinks his principles are worth more than his life." The confession hit Dalton like a physical punch, but it also gave him something he had been missing for months: certainty. This isn't just about protecting Cora anymore. This is about justice for Samuel. He is my brother. Marcus's smile widened. "Then, this is better than I thought. I will finish what I started." Two men faced each other across the dusty clearing, their hands hovering over their weapons. Dalton could hear his own heartbeat, but underneath it was something else. Samuel's voice from childhood, teaching him to shoot straight and stand up for what's right. "On 3, Marcus called out. 1. Dalton's mind cleared, focusing on the man who had killed his brother and terrorized an innocent woman. 2. Time seemed to slow down as both men's hands moved toward their guns. No. The void exploded with gunfire. Marcus was fast, faster than most men Dalton had ever faced. But the pain and righteous anger had sharpened Dalton's reflexes to razor sharpness. AR. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Webb lay motionless in the dust, his gun still half-cocked. But as Dalton stood over his brother's killer, Marcus's two remaining men stepped onto the porch with their weapons drawn. The skinny man's gun was pointed at Dalton's chest before he could react. "The boss may be dead, but you still killed him. That's murder, and it makes you a wanted man." Dalton's gun was out of ammo, and reloading would take precious seconds he didn't have. The two men approached slowly, enjoying their advantage. "Mind your own business, cowboy," said the third man. "Now you will pay for interfering." But before either of them could pull the trigger, a rifle shot rang out from the shack window. The skinny man spun around and fell, clutching his shoulder. Cora stood in the doorway, holding an old pistol with skill. "The next shot will not be a warning shot," she said calmly. The other gunman turned towards her, but Dalton used the distraction to dash behind Marcus and reload his weapon. As he stood up and fired, the last of Marcus's men fled back to their horses. Dalton let him go. A witness telling the true story could actually benefit them. Cora lowered her gun and walked over to where Marcus lay motionless. She looked down at the man who had controlled her life for months, and Dalton expected to see relief or satisfaction. Instead, her face only showed exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly. "But Dalton is studying Marcus's body, and something is wrong." "Cora, you said Marcus has my brother's watch." She nodded. "He always wears it on a chain like a trophy." Dalton knelt down and rummaged through Marcus's coat, finding the familiar silver watch that had belonged to their father before being passed down to Samuel. Seeing it again brought back a flood of memories. Christmas mornings, cattle drives, the proud day Samuel inherited it. But when Dalton opened the watch box, he found a surprise, Das. Inside, along with the initials SK that their father had carved, was a folded piece of paper. "What is it?" Cora asked. Dalton carefully unfolded the piece of paper. It was a map drawn in Samuel's handwriting, marking the location of something on the mountain north of here. At the bottom, Samuel wrote, "For my brother Dalton, if anything happens to me." Samuel knew Marcus would kill him, Dalton realized. He hid this message knowing that I would eventually get the watch back. Cora moved closer to look at the map. "What do you think he wants you to find?" Before Dalton could reply, the sound of approaching hooves made them both freeze. Several horsemen were coming up the trail, moving quickly. "That man escaped," said Cora. "He must have gone to call for help." But when the horsemen emerged from the trees, Dalton saw something that changed everything. The leader wore a sheriff's badge, and behind him were 6 armed deputies. "That's Sheriff Morrison," Cora whispered. "He's been looking for me since I disappeared. Marcus told him I was kidnapped by bandits." Dalton looked at Marcus Webb's body, then at the pregnant woman beside him holding a still-smoking rifle. In about 30 seconds, he would have to explain to the sheriff why he had killed a supposedly honorable man and why he had sheltered a kidnapped woman. But the map in his hand showed that Samuel had left him more than one clue about his death. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his calloused face surveying the scene. Marcus, wounded, was crawling towards his horse, and Cora was standing beside Dalton with her rifle. "Miss Cora," the sheriff said carefully. "Marcus Webb reported her abduction, saying he was organizing a search party." Cora stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "Sheriff Morrison, Marcus Webb forced me into marriage to pay off my father's medical debt. When I found out I was pregnant with another man's child, he became violent. I ran away to protect my child." The sheriff's eyes moved to Marcus's body. "And this man, Marcus Webb, murdered my brother Samuel 6 months ago," Dalton said, pulling out his watch. "He kept this as a trophy. Miss Lane heard him brag about it." Sheriff Morrison examined the watch, recognizing the initials and distinctive scratches that Samuel had always complained about. "I remember that watch. Samuel never went anywhere without it." "Marcus also attempted to burn down the shack I legally purchased and threatened to kill Miss Lane and her unborn child," Dalton continued. "I challenged him to a fair fight, and he accepted." The wounded man, now mounted on his horse, cried out in despair. "Sheriff, they have brutally murdered Mr. Webb. He was trying to rescue his wife." But Cora had already moved to her bag inside the shack, and returned with a bundle of papers. "These are the marriage papers that Marcus forced my dying father to sign. You will see the debts and threats written in Marcus's own handwriting." Sheriff Morrison studied the papers, his expression growing darker. "These are not legal marriage documents. These are blackmail papers." The wounded man realized his story was falling apart and urged his horse toward the tree line. But two deputies moved to block him. "The real question," said Sheriff Morrison, "is what happens now?" Dalton opened Samuel's map and gave it to the sheriff. "My brother left this to me before he died. It marks the location of the evidence he collected about Marcus's illegal activities: stolen water rights, murdered ranchers, extorted families." Samuel was investigating Marcus, the sheriff asked. "It was clear for months that he knew Marcus would eventually kill him, so he wrote everything down and hid it in a place only I would think to look for." 3 days later, following Samuel's map, they found a detailed record of Marcus Webb's crimes hidden in a cave north of the shack. Evidence implicated several corrupt officials and led to the recovery of thousands of dollars in stolen assets. Cora's marriage to Marcus was declared invalid by the territorial court, that DDD. The same court awarded her compensation for Marcus's confiscated assets, enough to ensure her children would never lack anything. 6 months later, Dalton stood on the porch of his rebuilt shack, watching Cora hang laundry to dry in the morning sun. End quote. Her pregnancy was now obvious, and she moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying a precious object. She looked up and met his eyes. "The baby kicked for the first time this morning," she said. Dalton smiled, still amazed at how completely his life had changed. He bought the shack, hoping to live alone, gnaw on his pain, and start over. Instead, he finds justice for Samuel, saves an innocent woman, and discovers that sometimes the best things in life come under the guise of trouble. "Have you decided on a name yet?" he asked. Cora's hand went to her stomach. "Samuel, if a boy, for the man who made all this possible." Dalton nodded, thinking his brother would approve. Samuel has always believed that good people will find each other when they need each other most. Looking at Cora now, safe, free, and ready to bring a new life into the world, Dalton knew his brother was right about more than just Marcus Webb's crimes. He thought, some of the deals turned out to be worth much more than he had ever imagined. What do you think of Dalton's fight? Let us know what you think. If you like the story, please leave a comment of 1. If you think it could be better, please leave a comment of 2. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.